Good morning, everyone, and welcome. Welcome to our virtual breakout session on impactful digital development, practical feedback loops for emerging technologies. My name is Thom Sinclair, and I'm the Senior Director for Knowledge Management and Collaborating Learning and Adapting at Bixal. And I'm joined by four very esteemed panelists who will walk through this subject this morning. I'm going to let them each introduce themselves, and we will begin with my colleague, Annah Ngaruro.
Thanks, Tom. Hi, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Annah Ngaruro. I'm Director for Technology Solutions at ICF within the International Health and Development line of business. I'm also currently the Data Exchange and Interoperability and Global Goods Group Lead on the SGAC Data Systems team.
Thank you, Anna. Let's move to John.
Hi, I'm John Zoltner. I'm the lead for Technology for Development and Innovation at Save the Children US. And I'm also the global lead for Save the Children International for protection from digital harm.
Thank you, John. Carla?
Good morning, everybody. My name is Carla Briceno, and I am the CEO and co-founder of Bixal. And I'm super excited to be here today and also to be a diamond sponsor of this wonderful event.
Thank you, Carla. And Nandini.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. I'm Nandini Harihareswara. I am a senior digital development and innovation consultant that working with Bixal, and have worked on the intersection of digital finance and technology for a good 15 years now with USAID, the UN, and other entities. Looking forward to a great conversation today.
Excellent. Thank you all. I'm also looking forward to this. I think this is going to be a lively exchange around impactful digital development. We put a lot of thought into how we might frame this, and we all realize that we're aware that effective digital development starts with designing for the end user in mind. But the truth is, in many of the places where we work as international development practitioners, there are a lot of barriers to effective digital development, including barriers to feedback loops for the users that we're working for. And that includes trying to overcome the gatekeepers who might prevent those voices from being part of our human-centered design and marginalizing those voices from being heard. So we're going to explore today some ideals and practicalities on integrating systematic agile HCD, human-centered design approaches, and look at how to ensure that those voices of the end users are heard, how we help shape and maximize their potential, and especially in the context of emerging technologies. So we're going to begin sort of a little open-ended. Nandini, just FYI, I'm going to begin with you. And I'll give you just a second to get your thought together, but the question is kind of open. We've been talking about this topic for a while, but why is it important, and why is it so important right now?
Yeah, I mean, so I think, I've been in digital development for a long time, like many of my colleagues on the panel. And, we've really made big strides and really made a big difference in a lot of sectors and a lot of areas in improving the quality of people's lives, especially marginalized populations. But there's several areas where still, I think we really face a lot of challenges. And given the era of emerging technologies, AI at the forefront, that's really going to kind of change how we do things, both internally within our systems, but also externally in terms of how we use them to improve digital outcomes. We really need to take a moment and reflect. Up until now, how have we done? And when we reflect as a group, I think two of the big challenges we still actually don't do a very good job of is really integrating the feedback of marginalized people into the creation of products, platforms, and policies. we still don't really have effective, robust, sustainable feedback loops for that process. And secondly, we haven't really effectively been able to operationalize how to address gatekeeping, right? I call it gatekeeping. Really, the men, boys, village chiefs, sometimes women, others who in various geographies and cultures represent the power that sometimes is the foundational issue for women and other marginalized populations from having access to technology or financial services or whatever we're talking about because of cultural and social norms. I think those are two really big pieces that we haven't really come to terms with, we haven't really been able to figure out yet. And so as we're going into this new era with emerging technologies, how do we make sure that we try to learn from the best stuff we've done so far on those two topics and apply it to what's coming next and really be thoughtful and intentional about it? Because, you know, we always know ICT can just as much bring people along as leave people behind. And that's, I think, one of my big concerns.
Thank you. So we've learned a lot. Now we need to figure out how to apply it with new emerging technologies. Carla, I'm going to pass it to you. Same question. How do you think about that? Why this right now is so important?
I'm thinking a lot about the importance of localization, and in our new sort of post-pandemic world, the increasing likelihood of people not being able to travel. People have gotten sort of used to doing things in different ways. And, you know, I just think we really need to think about sort of private sector practices like Agile and human-centered design, and using these methodologies to do a much better job, I believe, at really listening and hearing the voices of those marginalized communities by adopting these tactics. So I think that with, you know, less travel going on, more remote connections, virtual connections with the communities that we seek to serve, and the importance of really adopting an iterative approach where we can involve the communities we seek to serve, the stakeholders, using human-centered design is key at the moment.
Thank you, Carla. So there's a lot there. I think we're going to unpack through this session around applying Agile and HCD in the spaces where we work, and how we do that without necessarily being there, right? What does that mean if we do it remotely? So John, I'm going to move to you and ask you that same question.
Sure, thanks, Tom. To stick with localization, I think that if the communities we're working with don't have agency over the type of work that we're doing or the content or how we do it, it doesn't really matter if we have those feedback loops, because what we do is we end up designing a project that doesn't really work for them or doesn't work within their context. And then we say, what do you think about this project that doesn't really work in your context? Give us a feedback about that. So I think the way we design our projects has to be integrated with the way we go about getting feedback on them. And in order to do that, you have to have local partners who you respect and who you engage in the work that you're doing and the planning for it and the execution. And then we can focus on getting actionable feedback.
Excellent, thank you. So we have to be there from the beginning. They have to be involved from the beginning. Feedback loops are put in place after something's thought through and even partially designed. It's too late at that point. Anna, I'm going to turn to you. It's your time.
Yeah, the core of human-centered design really is about engaging the relevant stakeholders and centering on their needs. And at the core, even before you start, it's who are the humans you're talking about? Is it us, donors, the implementing partners, all of that? So it's really central to the first question of who are the people, who are the humans that we are talking about? And if we are able to really define who is going to be using this tool, how is it going to impact them? What are they going to be using it for? How is this going to be useful to them? Then we can begin to really understand and center on who the users are. And then we can plan around that. And then also going back to Agile, once we've identified who the humans are, and then we want these iteration and feedback loops, it centers back on that. Those same people that we have identified are the ones we will be getting feedback from and iterating with. And iteration is really it's a verb, it's an action. So it's something that is ongoing. So it's an ongoing engagement with those users who you have identified as the keys in the human-centered design.
Excellent, thank you. I love that phrase. Who are the humans in the human-centered design, right? We need to know that from the very beginning. Nandini, I'm going to turn it to you now. So I know you have experience doing this in Zambia and Malawi, and I'm sure other places also. What has been your experience of creating those feedback loops for localized user input? Who are those humans? How do you begin with them? And if you want to touch on the gatekeepers, and we can also kind of come back to that too.
So, I mean, I guess I would say, I wrote a blog a long time ago called HCD Skeptic to Believer. I was a huge HCD skeptic in 2014, 15. Everybody in Washington, D.C. was talking about HCD. Dahlberg came up with a bunch of seminars, webinars about it, and others. And I was very skeptical. I was like, this is a very kind of, hit them once, but nothing really happens in the long term kind of pilots that don't mean anything. I landed on the ground in Zambia, worked with local stakeholders, especially private sector, and realized what seemed like it was best practice in Silicon Valley, and more, what we were seeing in Silicon Valley around A/B testing, human-centered design, et cetera, was not the norm in the countries that I was working in. And maybe, even more to put a fine point on it, they would test products with in-house, right? So staff within a bank, staff within a fintech would be testing products to see if they would work, right? They'd say, oh, my grandmother would react this way, but they wouldn't actually give it to their grandmother, right? And so the art of human-centered design to be testing with small groups of people, it didn't have to be huge, to show them how you can do it in a very because cost effectiveness is super important to these entities, right? They also see HCD as something expensive that they can't afford. And so to share with them what these practices were, sit with them and do it with them, I think we do it with multiple entities, often who were competitors with each other in a market. We were working to try to change the norm in a market, and it was relatively successful. We worked with them to say, well, who are you targeting? And then actually go to markets, to multiple geographies beyond the capital city, to sit with users and walk them through, well, what is your customer journey? And really do customer journey analyses and agent journey analyses, which were critical. And we were able to give them immediate actionable recommendations, which they took on their product, on their marketing, and so on and so forth. And so I think they found the value of it, and they found it to not be costly. And I think those were two super, super important elements of doing it. I think finding people to test products wasn't very hard. People were very interested in giving their feedback on their product experiences and what was working, what wasn't working. So, finding people And especially those that maybe aren't asked as much was actually quite easy once you kind of started the process. We talked to women's groups when we did a project called Sprint for Women that was focused on increasing financial products for women and how do you increase your customer base. And we went out to other geographies beyond just the urban centers to talk to women's groups, talk to women on the street who were just informal sellers of things, and talk to them about what, would this product be useful to you? How, what do you currently use, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that element of it, once you get them started, once you can show them it can be done in a low cost, it can be done quickly, you can action recommendations quickly, that's actually not so hard to do after a little bit of time, trust, and investment. I think the harder piece that we haven't really been able to break a ton of ground around is really helping financial institutions and others understand how to engage gatekeepers when that's really one of the main barriers in particular geographies. There's a few groups. IDEO.org has done great work with the Gates Foundation on women and money, talking about how to engage men and women around financial education to try to break some of those barriers. CARE has an amazing toolkit that they have developed after decades of work in women's savings groups on how to engage men and boys to try to increase women's access to informal and formal financial services. And we can talk more about that as time goes on today, Thom.
That's fantastic. Thank you. So was it the concept that was there in the culture? It was introduced, people took to it, and there's so much about what you said, and we'll dig in through the session. But one thing that really caught my attention was that people wanted to be asked, they wanted to be part of that, right? They were interested in being asked their opinion.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely. They enjoyed it.
Enjoyed it. That's awesome. John, I know you have an example that's different from Nepal around digital hangouts. Can you tell us about that?
Sure. Yeah, in Nepal, when the pandemic hit, we had been working with youth in youth groups around the country in order to get youth input into our programming, which programs we should provide and how we should provide them. And for instance, social behavior change programs. If you're not consulting youth about programs designed to change their behavior, then they just don't work. So we had in place a consultative mechanism for youth around the country in every province that wasn't digital at all. It depended on coming in person to centers. So when the pandemic hit, we had that mechanism, we had the relationships with the youth. So it was relatively easy for us then to deploy a digital system to do what we started calling digital hangouts, which provided a way to get input from children, get them to talk about what their concerns were, what their fears around the pandemic were, also to squash misinformation, because of course there were a lot of rumors going on and a lot of non-accurate information being traded. So we were able to address that information that was health and COVID related, but also it became a mechanism just to ask youth about anything or allow them to give input about anything. So I think when you create these mechanisms that can bring in feedback or bring in information from the populations that we're working with, they can be used for many reasons, and so they can be more valuable than you even plan when you deploy them. So but one thing we learned is that through the digital hangouts, one of the problems, of course, we ran into was that not everyone is online, and it's difficult to get participation from everyone. So we have to come up with workarounds for that in order to get technology into the hands of people who haven't had it before. But also it highlighted for us that not everyone was ever represented, because there were always people with disabilities or people for one reason or another who are more vulnerable, less likely to show up in person at an event. And so technology done right can help us meet those people who aren't part of the conversation or aren't involved in the consultations that we're doing to make it in the end more inclusive.
So just one quick follow-up question. So how, because it sounds like you had to build a lot of trust to make this happen. What are some of the things that you did to build that trust with the youth, and before, I guess, even before it became digital?
Yeah, I mean, I think people know whether they're really a part of what's happening around them. So I think if you don't get trust if you're not asking people for their opinion and input, and they don't feel like they're co-creators in the case of international development in projects that we design and implement. So I think it's really that people need to feel agency around the work that you're doing, because if they don't, then they're never going to trust you. And then it's having some kind of mechanism set up so that it's regular, people know it will happen, and people know there's an opportunity and a way to contribute their voice.
Excellent, thank you. So people want to be involved, they want to have their opinions heard, and they will trust if they feel you're actually listening and that they have agency. Carla and Anna, this question is to both of you. How can we take those lessons that we heard that on the ground, they were digital, but they were on the ground, Zambia and Malawi and Nepal. How can we do that virtually, or can we do that virtually? Actually, let me ask that first, as well as in person. And Carla, I'll start with you.
Yeah, as we talked about a bit earlier, the pros and cons of in-person user research and interaction with the users that we seek to involve and in the process and understand their needs, their pain points, etc. With in-person, of course, you have the opportunity to observe closely, but that same observation can actually have a notable effect when you're in person. So using virtual means of conducting research can actually really open you up to, one, avoiding that sort of observation effect, and increase sort of your flexibility and reach, which can allow you to reach more diverse communities that are more geographically dispersed, depending on the type of digital initiative that you're engaged in. And you can use a lot of really rich digital tools to collect data, perspectives. You can even collect data anonymously, and also engage over time. So like using diary studies and other ways of engaging with these same users over time to keep them involved in the process. And if you're using Agile approaches to developing whatever solution or digital tool that you might be developing, continuing to iterate, get their feedback, conduct usability, etc. So I really think that the pros very much outweigh the cons, and that we should really be thinking about using virtual user engagement, input, and interaction.
Thank you. Yeah, so it sounds like there are definitely some pros, increasing geographic reach, removing that observation effect. and the ability, the different tools that you can use. So I really like that. Anna, I'm going to turn that same question to you. I think you might have also had a follow-up to John, so I'll give you the floor for both of those.
Yeah, so I think that with the format, what really is important is to be intentional in identifying the barriers for each of those particular formats. Virtual might have the issue of people not being very comfortable with the technology. And then the session would be focused on, oh, how does this work? What do I look like, and all of that. And then, like Carla mentioned, in person, there might be, maybe gatekeepers, or people are not, don't want to speak in case somebody, they assume that somebody is making a judgment. So I think we need to be very intentional. We can't just go in hoping, fingers crossed. We have to plan in advance, and also intentionally reduce and neutralize those barriers. It could include, making sure that at every session you are setting the right tone. Even in my past experience, saying things like, your feedback is not going to change your status as a beneficiary in this program, or it's not going to be reported back to the donor or implementing partner, and just reiterating that. And then also, even in person, just organizing the session, by maybe looking at who your users are and seeing, okay, maybe we need to conduct one-on-one sessions to avoid the presence of gatekeepers. So just really being intentional is very, very important, because intentionality helps you to plan and reduce those barriers to those, whatever format you choose, be it virtual or in person. I think the one comment I did have about feedback loops is, together with agency, I think it's really important for us to really communicate that the input and knowledge that we are getting from users is of value, and that we recognize and understand that. And then we also need to come back and say, what did we do with this information? And draw a correlation between, you told us this was your pain point, this is the solution, so that we can build trust and show that we are actually listening and we are using this information because it is useful and it's of value to us.
So that's an important part of the chain, right? Actually showing that you were interested and really wanted to share your input, and you felt like you actually had agency and you were listened to. And then here's sort of the proving it by showing you that what you gave input to actually shows the input, or that you and your community gave. You brought gatekeepers back up, and I think that's really interesting, sort of an interesting segue back to that, because I'd like to look at how maybe some of these online tools, maybe even some of these one-on-ones that you mentioned, Anna, might support that. But I'll just kind of open that up to the rest of you. How can we, one question is, how can we utilize some digital tools to, I don't know if we circumvent, but to get, let's say, get to the user and get past the gatekeeper?
Carla, you said you had a small follow-up in the chat.
Yeah, I mean, it's some of those rich digital tools that I mentioned include, digital whiteboards, of course, screen sharing, video recordings, digital note-taking, collaborative whiteboards. So in terms of gatekeepers, the folks that you'd be engaging virtually would need to access a computer and be online directly, but also possibly using focus groups to gather folks around. I can't really comment on the point of getting past gatekeepers with these tools. Not sure if John or Nandini have any ideas on that front.
Oh, go ahead, John.
I was just going to say that I think there are ways of sharing equipment at times, having kind of micro meeting places. So instead of where we used to have everyone come to a community center, maybe meeting with people very close to where you live. But also just on a larger point around gatekeepers, I think we also have to be open to the fact that we might be gatekeepers sometimes, so that we just need to be very aware of the power dynamics between, what we're doing and how we're interacting with the communities that we're serving, because we won't get that feedback, we won't get that input a lot of times just because of those power dynamics that people won't want to, like Anna was saying, they're concerned about being kicked out of the program and not receiving whatever benefit they would receive otherwise.
Very important point.
I did thought on just that's so on point. What she said around making sure that it's articulated from a source they trust, that if honest feedback on whatever it is, product, platform, policy, whatever, will not have any impact on the benefits they're receiving, is like critical for sure. And beautiful point, John, that we are the gatekeepers often. And like, the power dynamics sometimes are really awkward. Like you go under the ground and you think about a intervention you want to do to try to improve women's economic empowerment. And Thom, I would never say I would want to use an intervention to get through the gatekeepers. I would say I want to use an intervention to help get them on board. Because at the end of the day, it's not sustainable, because they're still the power brokers. They still have the power. So even if like in a small moment, we're able to do something, in the long term, it's not sustainable unless they're on board. But, I think I mentioned a couple examples. I think one of the IDEO.org Women and Money examples that I really, really like is bringing, right when they get married, a husband and wife come together and do like a deep dive digital and financial literacy training on all of the products that they have available to them, and maybe even some more with whatever the program is, and are given sort of a roadmap that they do together on some of the milestones around increasing their access to finance and digital literacy. And therefore, you're still, you still have to be aware of that power structure. Like, we are a third-party entity that is coming from probably a developed country, talking to folks that are significantly, more marginalized or lower income than us. Us doing this is saying, oh, people outside who are powerful are telling us to do this. We have to think about, like, is that sustainable? What will happen after we leave, et cetera, which is why it's important to, sort of try to engage gatekeepers beyond just the husband in this example. But yeah, I mean, I think digital tools can be done remotely. As Carla said, like, it depends on the context, I think. Whether you're using digital tools or not, still the engagement of gatekeepers is what's required to be kind of try to break that down in a sustainable way.
Yeah, that is exactly right. I think I'm going to just use that last piece to segue us just a little bit to talk about tools and ways of methods of approaching this. And John, I think you had a specific example. I'm not going to say what it is. I'm going to ask you if you would talk to us about some of the multiple methods that you know of to reach different populations.
Well, yeah. When we talked the other day, one of the things I was left thinking is that when we're doing human-centered design, it's really important in areas like tech for development, where we're always talking to our colleagues everyone's interested in using tech in some way in order to make our projects more efficient or effective or more scalable. And I think we have to be aware that we all know that it's difficult sometimes to get tech into the hands of the communities we're working with. So we have to plan for that in any project design. But also, I think we have to be open to not using tech or using a mix of channels or media for connecting with people and providing whatever information or benefit we're trying to provide. So an example for me that I think works really well is with the pandemic, suddenly we found more than 1.5 billion children displaced from their schools. And in Sudan and in North Darfur, we work with the Ministry of Health to create educational content and content around COVID health messages. And we did that in part by using technology. We set up an IVR system, interactive voice response, and we sent more than 1 million text messages to the people who we knew had cell phones in partnership with the telecom network. But we also bolted loudspeakers onto Land Rovers and drove around through all the villages. And we worked with a local theater group to kind of script little vignettes providing that same information, but in a different format in the most low-tech way possible in order to get that message out. And I think if you're not thinking in human-centered design, if you're not thinking about all the ways that you can provide information to people or engage people, which include many ways that don't have anything to do with technology, then you'll miss a great opportunity.
So that's a great segue to one of the first comments we have from one of our participants, and I'm going to ask you all to respond if you have something, but specifically Carla and Anna, because I think you've both spoken to this in different ways. But Michael Weinrob says, when we talk about digital tools, I think the method or structures are more important than the platform or channel. Though it has to be accessible, and definitely accessible, and there are definitely issues with access to technology. But his point is that the methods or structures are more important. So that is, the facilitation structures we use to invite participation, annotation, engagement are where the action is. And I wondered if either of you could respond to that, either or both.
Yeah, that really speaks to, being intentional and really planning carefully. So knowing your users and making sure you're planning carefully, when as part of the PEPFAR's Digital Health Investment Inventory tool, we conducted 18 virtual key interviews with stakeholders in Uganda and Zimbabwe. And we carefully planned these and with a moderator guide or a facilitation guide that was very explicit in really, first of all, making sure that whoever is moderating, keeps reiterating there are no right or wrong answers. And also not making, any judgments on what you've been told, and just keep repeating that also. If somebody says, was I supposed to do that? And you say, no, there is no right or wrong answer. I want to see how you do it. And then also really asking open-ended questions, like, walk me through how you would do this. And that really allows for the user to tell you, a wide breadth of things that you may not even have thought was possible. And one of them is, for us, is we found out that some of the responses in these tools required collaboration across colleagues. And so they needed to go offline, have a discussion about this, and then come back. And so it was only through asking them, how would you get this information, that you got a response like, well, I need to contact somebody in this department. I need to get information from here. We need to sit down and discuss. And that really ended up being, we were able to design the tool so that we could then, you know, you could save whatever had been put into the tool, allow for somebody to come back and put the responses in. And so kind of it helped for that offline consultation to happen, which is something we wouldn't have found out if we just had asked a very narrow question. So that really helped us to hone into what is the workflow involved here? How do people actually get this information? Who do they need to contact? And it helped with you know, having no value judgments on any of that, because then people are able to tell us, we need to ask this person for this information. We need to then synthesize this with this. And, you know, just really making it open for them to tell us what is the process.
Thank you, Anna. And it drives home also a point that is being made in the chat from Jaime Jarvis, who says that, well, I'll just read what he says, and I'll put my sort of spin on it, and that's the word he uses. I think there's a tendency to spin terms like HCD or Agile to help convince clients and partners that deliberate engagement will speed the process, right? So we're going to use this, and it's going to make for a faster process. But the reality is that doing this intentionally, an intentional approach, including trying to mitigate gatekeepers, requires time, expert facilitation. And Anna, what you just said obviously was involved in the work that you mentioned. That takes time to do that, and humility within the process of facilitation, whether it's remote or in person. So, Carla, I'm going to turn to you and see if you would respond to that.
Sure, and thank you, Jaime, for your point. I do agree with you. It's not I would say that the process of, you know, really digging in and understanding your user groups by developing personas and conducting research, and then using the outcomes of that research to really prioritize user needs in the development of any digital solution that you might be developing takes time. But I would be concerned that we just dismissed Agile and HCD because of spin. What we're seeing, Bixal is a company that works both domestically with federal agencies and with USAID, both here in the States and abroad. And what we're seeing is more and more federal agencies are really getting on board and providing access to members of the public to conduct real user research and involve people in the process. So I think that if we expect our digital solutions that we develop to really meet the mark and meet the specific pain points or address the specific pain points of those users that we're building them for, then we really need to understand these needs and adopt approaches where we can continue to iterate and get feedback through the process of designing and developing these solutions, and continued involvement not only of users, but also local organizations, because ownership is so critical for the longevity of these solutions. So I hope it's not just being deemed as spin, because I think it's more and more important, and that we should probably all dig in and learn more about the methodologies that can be used in terms of human-centered design and user research, and dig in even further.
So I think this panel is probably 100% on board with you. And so here's a question to the other panelists. How do we move our client? How do we move the needle? So we know that there are a lot of folks in donor agencies, and let's pick USAID in particular, because I think we all do work with USAID and other donors, but there are a lot who also, Carla, would be right on board with you, but not everybody. How do we begin to move or continue, I should say? There's been a lot of work already done. How do we continue to move our clients in understanding how important human-centered design is, building in an agile way, even knowing that it might take more time than sort of maybe more time than we expected. So Nandini, please.
I want to, a very, very good consultant that I worked with many decades ago said something that is maybe a summary of what Carla just said, which is go slow to go fast. And, you know, I think we have seen, especially in emerging markets, especially in places where they are adopting policies, products, platforms that don't go through sufficient testing, that don't go through sufficient human-centered design testing, that they lose time and money during and as they go through the process of product development in the product life cycle, right? And I mean, if you're talking about a policy, you know, obviously we would apply a different life cycle to a policy, but still they would still have to iterate, and policy making takes even longer, right? So it's really about going slow to go fast. Do the homework, do the work. There are low cost ways of doing it. The colleague who, Jaime or Jamie, however you pronounce it, you know, absolutely, especially the gatekeeping piece costs money. There's no doubt about it. Like, it's hard to do a low cost option of that. But if you're really looking to capture a market that is going to help, especially a private sector player, reduce churn, which is a big issue, right? Dormancy and churn for digital and financial products, especially in emerging markets, but actually everywhere, is a big issue, right? So if you're really looking to address those issues, then it's worth the investment, right? And so, you know, I think it's really important. I really like the question because I think it's honest. And I think it talks in language that we do have to talk about when you are trying to convince private sector to do something differently, which is a lot of this work in digital development. Even when you're working with policymakers, even when you're working with donors, at the end of the day, you actually have to convince private sector to do something differently. And if you want to convince them to do something differently, there has to be a business case that they buy, right? And obviously a subsidy to show them that this is worth their money in the long run. And so, yeah, go slow to go fast. And there's a business case, I think, are critical elements to how to do this. I don't know if we really have built a substantial amount of information to build a business case on gatekeeping engagement. That's partially why it makes sense to begin engaging. Well, I mean, many parties have already begun to engage, so I don't want to pretend work hasn't already been done out there with policymakers, because policymakers are big gatekeepers as well. And often gatekeepers look to policymakers for the cultural and social norms, right? It's a kind of a cycle. So anyways, don't want to dominate.
Yeah.
Those were
no,
really
it's all right. I'm being told in the chat that we're ending in just a minute. John, I think you have a comment though, so we can make that the last one and then we'll wrap up.
Well, I was just going to wholly agree with Nandini. I think that I think we need to educate donors also, because so much of the work in this sector is kind of dictated by donors, or they obviously have a very strong hand in what's done, and they have to understand that it takes time to be consultative enough to design a good program. So if if I get funding in May and I need to start up the project in June, and I don't leave myself enough time to do real HCD, then I'm not consulting people enough, and I might hit all my targets on my Gantt chart, but I'm not going to design an effective program, and that's not what they're looking for.
And you might not hit your end target, John, on like
Exactly.
reaching a certain number of customers in marginalized communities.
Thank you so much for this very rich conversation. Carla, Anna, John, Nandini, I appreciate it. We are concluding, and I want you all to have a wonderful day. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Tom.
All righty.
Thank you all.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks, everyone.
Great job,
Thanks
Tom.
for
Thank
joining
you, everyone.
us.